The storm began without warning, sweeping across the quiet neighborhood with sheets of rain and gusts of wind that rattled windows and bent tree branches. Margaret sat alone in her kitchen, sipping tea, the soft light above her casting long shadows across the room. She was used to nights like this, quiet, uneventful, and heavy with solitude. At 52, after years of raising her daughter alone and keeping her household steady, she had grown accustomed to silence. But tonight, the storm carried an energy that unsettled her, like something was about to change. The knock at the door startled her. It was firm but not aggressive, cutting through the sound of wind. Setting her cup aside, she hurried to the door, unsure of who would come out in such weather. When she opened it, the rain pushed against her face, and standing there was Daniel, her daughter Emily's boyfriend. His hair was plastered to his forehead, his jacket soaked through, and his expression both apologetic and concerned. "Margaret," he said quickly, his voice raised above the rain. "I'm sorry to just show up, but I was driving home when the storm got worse. I thought I should check in on you. Emily told me the power here goes out sometimes during heavy weather." Margaret blinked, caught between surprise and confusion. Daniel was polite whenever he visited with Emily, but they had never spent time alone. She had not expected him to think of her tonight, much less arrive at her door through a storm. She stepped aside instinctively, and he entered, dripping water across the entryway floor. "You didn't have to do this," she said, closing the door against the roar of the wind. Her voice was steady, but her chest tightened with a mixture of gratitude and unease. "But thank you." Daniel gave her a small smile, one that softened his sharp features. "I couldn't just drive by. I know Emily's away for the weekend, and, well, I didn't want you to be alone if something happened." Margaret studied him in the dim kitchen light. He was too young to be standing there worrying about her, but there was nothing careless in his manner. His presence felt genuine, not forced. He shook off his jacket and hung it by the door, and for a brief moment, Margaret saw him not as her daughter's boyfriend, but simply as a man who had thought of her when no one else did. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. Darkness swallowed the room, broken only by the flashes of lightning outside. Margaret sighed, already knowing where she kept the candles. Before she could move, Daniel had pulled out his phone to light the space, following her into the kitchen. Together, they lit a few candles, their soft glow pushing back the shadows. The house, usually so quiet, now felt different, alive with the sound of rain on the roof, the creak of branches outside, and the low hum of two people unexpectedly sharing a night. Margaret noticed how Daniel moved without hesitation, checking the locks on the doors and making sure the windows were sealed. It was a small act, but one that made her feel strangely cared for. They settled in the living room, each wrapped in a blanket, the flickering candlelight reflecting off the walls. Margaret wasn't used to company, not like this, not when Emily wasn't around. She felt a tug of awkwardness, but also a growing curiosity. Daniel broke the silence first. "You must get storms like this often here. More than I'd like," she replied, her voice calm, though her thoughts were anything but. She had been alone for so long that company felt foreign, yet comforting. They talked about simple things at first, the storm, the old creaks of the house, the memories of winters past. Daniel shared stories from his childhood, of camping trips gone wrong and rainy days that ended in laughter. Margaret found herself smiling, even laughing softly, something she hadn't done freely in a long time. She tried not to notice the details, the way his voice lowered when he spoke sincerely, the steadiness in his eyes, the ease with which he carried himself. She reminded herself that he was Emily's boyfriend, younger, living a life full of possibilities while hers had long settled into routine. But still, his presence stirred something inside her, a warmth that surprised her more than the storm itself. The thunder rolled closer, shaking the walls, but Margaret hardly noticed. What unsettled her now wasn't the storm outside, but the unexpected calm she felt in the company of this young man. She hadn't invited it, hadn't even wanted it, yet it had arrived at her door, unannounced and undeniable. As the candles flickered and the rain poured, Margaret realized this night would be remembered. Not because of the storm, but because of the unexpected visitor who stepped into her quiet world and left her heart unsteady. The storm outside grew heavier, the sound of rain hitting the roof like 1,000 drums. Then, with a sudden snap, the power went out completely, plunging the house into silence except for the storm's roar. Margaret sighed, already reaching for the candles. Daniel was quicker. He had his phone out, lighting the way as though he had lived in the house for years. His calm presence steadied her. Together, they lit the candles, placing them around the room until the flickering glow filled the space with a gentle, golden warmth. The old house felt different, in that light smaller, softer, almost safe. Margaret wrapped herself in a blanket, while Daniel checked the basement and the back door to make sure the storm hadn't caused damage. She watched him move through her home with ease, as though helping her came naturally. It struck her deeply. So few people had thought of her needs since Emily had grown up and gone out into the world. When he returned to the living room, his hair still damp, he dropped into the chair opposite her, pulling a blanket around his shoulders. "Everything looks fine," he said. "The basement's dry. You don't have to worry." Margaret gave a small smile. "Thank you, Daniel. I didn't realize how nice it feels to have someone else checking." The words came out softer than she intended. She quickly looked away, focusing on her tea. But Daniel didn't seem uncomfortable. He just nodded, like he understood the weight behind her simple statement. They sat together, the candlelight flickering between them. Conversation came slowly at first, but once it started, it didn't stop. Margaret found herself talking about things she rarely shared: her favorite old books, the garden she once kept, the quiet routine of her days. Daniel listened closely, never interrupting, his eyes steady on hers. He asked thoughtful questions, and when he laughed at one of her stories, it was genuine, warm, and free of judgment. In turn, he told her about his family, his love for hiking, the way he dreamed of traveling after finishing school. His stories were simple, but there was something refreshing about them. He spoke with energy, with hope, with a belief that life was wide open. Margaret hadn't felt that kind of energy in years, and hearing it now stirred something inside her she couldn't quite name. As the hours passed, the storm softened, but neither of them seemed in a rush for the night to end. They sat wrapped in their blankets, sipping tea, listening to the rain, sharing little pieces of themselves. Margaret found herself laughing more than she expected, and each laugh felt like a small release, a reminder of who she once had been. She noticed details she hadn't before: the way Daniel's eyes brightened when he spoke about something he cared about, the steadiness of his voice, the respect in his tone. He never said anything inappropriate, never crossed a line, but his kindness and attention carried a weight she couldn't ignore. At one point, the house creaked loudly, and she jumped. Daniel glanced at her, a smile tugging at his lips. "Don't worry," he said, voice light but reassuring. "Old houses always talk during storms. It's harmless." His words, simple as they were, made her feel safe. She realized how long it had been since someone had spoken to her with such quiet confidence. It wasn't just his presence, it was the way he seemed to see her. Not as an obligation, not as Emily's mom, but as a person. That thought both warmed and unsettled her. Margaret shifted in her chair, reminding herself of the boundaries that should exist. Yet when Daniel leaned back, stretching his arms behind his head and laughing at something she said, she couldn't stop the smile that rose to her lips. It felt too easy, too natural. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was thick with something unspoken, something neither of them dared name. The candles flickered, shadows dancing across the walls, and Margaret suddenly felt the air grow heavier, as if the storm had moved indoors. She took a slow breath, willing her heart to calm, reminding herself of who he was and who she was still. She couldn't ignore the truth. It had been years since she felt this alive, since someone had looked at her with such attention. The realization startled her, and she quickly busied herself with gathering the empty cups. Daniel rose to help, their hands brushing briefly as they both reached for the same mug. It was nothing, a small accident. But Margaret felt her chest tighten. She pulled back quickly, avoiding his eyes while he paused as though searching for the right words. He said nothing, only gave a small nod and returned to his seat. But the silence that followed felt charged, as if both of them understood something had shifted, even if neither would admit it. As the night wore on, the storm outside weakened, but inside, Margaret's emotions only grew stronger. She hadn't expected company. She hadn't expected warmth. She hadn't expected to feel seen. Yet here she was sitting across from her daughter's boyfriend, realizing that small moments shared stories, soft laughter. A steady hand in the dark could stir feelings she thought she had buried long ago. And as the last candle burned low, Margaret understood one thing with certainty. This night was no longer about the storm outside. It was about the storm quietly rising within her. The storm outside finally began to weaken, the thunder more distant, the rain softer against the windows. But inside the house, the quiet grew heavier. Only one candle still burned on the coffee table, its glow barely lighting the room. Margaret sat on the couch, pulling the blanket closer around her shoulders. She could feel her heartbeat quickening for no clear reason, though she told herself it was just the long night, the storm. The strangeness of company she hadn't expected. Daniel sat across from her, relaxed but alert, his eyes steady on her as though he was studying her face, noticing things no one else had cared to see. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but full, like something waiting to be spoken. Margaret reached for her teacup, but her hand trembled slightly. She hoped he wouldn't notice, but of course he did. "Are you cold?" Daniel asked softly, leaning forward, his voice low and gentle. "No," she answered quickly, though the truth was more complicated. She wasn't cold at all. If anything, the air around her felt too warm, charged in a way she couldn't explain. Daniel didn't press, but after a moment he reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. The touch was brief, steady, nothing more than reassurance, yet it sent a wave through her that she hadn't felt in years. His hand was warm, grounding, as though he wanted to steady not just her shaking fingers, but something deeper. She froze, caught between instinct and longing, before slowly pulling her hand back. She told herself it was right to keep distance, but the memory of that small touch lingered like a spark in her skin. Daniel watched her carefully, his expression thoughtful, respectful, yet carrying something unspoken. Then he spoke, his words deliberate, as though he had been holding them back all evening. "Margaret," he said, his voice quiet but certain, "I know this might not be the right moment, but I can't keep it in. I admire you more than you know." She blinked, startled. Her lips parted, but no words came. She stared at him, waiting, almost afraid of what he would say next. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes steady on hers. "You've lived with so much responsibility, carrying everything alone, and yet you're still kind, still strong. I've noticed it from the first day I met you. You don't let people see how much you've done, but I see it, and it humbles me." Margaret's chest tightened. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. She had spent years being invisible, years where her efforts passed unnoticed, years where silence filled the spaces where appreciation should have been. And now here was Daniel Young, thoughtful, someone who shouldn't be speaking these words to her. Yet he had said exactly what she had longed to hear. Her throat felt dry. She turned her gaze toward the candle instead of his eyes, afraid of the emotions welling inside her. "Daniel," she whispered, unsure what she was about to say. She couldn't allow herself to encourage something impossible. Yet she couldn't deny how deeply his words struck her. "I don't mean to make this difficult," he said quickly, sensing her unease. "I just needed you to know. You're not invisible, Margaret. You're someone who deserves to be seen." Her breath caught, sharp and unsteady. No one had spoken to her like this since her late husband, and even then, not with such clarity. She felt seen, and it scared her. It was too much. It's too close to the line she had promised herself never to cross. She rose from the couch suddenly, gathering the empty cups, pretending she needed to tidy up. Anything to escape the weight of his gaze. But even as she moved to the kitchen, his words followed her, echoing in her heart. "You're not invisible. Margaret stood by the sink staring at her trembling hands. She hated that she felt alive because of words she shouldn't have heard. She hated that she couldn't stop her heart from racing. She hated that part of her wanted to hear him say more. Behind her, she heard Daniel's footsteps. He stopped at the edge of the kitchen, giving her space. His voice was calm when he spoke again. "I know it's not my place, Margaret. I respect you, and I respect Emily. But I couldn't stay here tonight and pretend. I don't see who you really are." She closed her eyes, struggling to breathe steadily. She wanted to tell him to stop, to leave, to never speak of this again. But when she turned to face him, the words stuck in her throat. His expression wasn't reckless or selfish, it was honest. There was no arrogance in his eyes, only sincerity. Margaret gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. "Daniel," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't say things like that." "I know," he replied softly. "But sometimes the truth is hard to hold back." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to disappear. The storm, the house. The years between them, everything faded except the weight of that moment. Margaret turned away again, unable to let the silence grow into something more. She busied herself with the dishes, even though there was nothing left to wash. She told herself it was foolish, that the night would end and life would return to normal once the morning came. But deep down, she knew nothing would ever feel quite the same. The storm outside faded into gentle rain. But inside Margaret's heart, a different storm had begun, quiet, powerful, and impossible to ignore. Daniel's words had broken through walls she thought would never fall, leaving her shaken and speechless, and as she blew out the last candle and the room slipped into shadow, she realized that the darkness around her was easier to face than the light Daniel had just placed in her heart. The first light of morning slipped through the curtains, pale and gentle after the long night. The storm had finally passed. The trees outside dripped quietly, the air smelled fresh, and the world seemed calmer, as though nothing unusual had happened. But inside Margaret's chest, nothing felt calm. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, Daniel's words echoed. "You're not invisible. You're someone worth seeing." She moved slowly through the kitchen, trying to collect herself. She wanted the morning to feel ordinary, to erase the strange intensity of the night before. But when she turned, she saw Daniel already there, moving about her kitchen as if it were his own. He was making coffee, humming softly under his breath, completely at ease. The sight unsettled her, comforting on one level, complicated on another. "Morning," he said warmly, glancing over his shoulder. "I thought I'd get the coffee started for you." Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you," she managed, her voice quieter than usual. She sat at the table, watching him pour water into the machine, his movements steady, natural. It was such a small thing, but it made the house feel alive in a way it hadn't for years. When he placed a steaming mug in front of her, she wrapped her hands around it, needing the warmth. The silence stretched for a moment before Daniel spoke again, his voice softer this time. "About last night." Margaret froze, her fingers tightening on the mug. She wasn't sure she wanted to hear what would follow. But Daniel continued, choosing each word carefully. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you. I know I crossed a line by saying what I said, but I can't take it back and I don't want to. You deserve to hear it." She looked at him, her throat tight. His eyes weren't reckless, and there was no hint of shamanly honesty. "Daniel," she began, struggling to find words, "you don't understand. Things like that can't be said. Not between us. It's not right." "I know," he said quietly, nodding. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know the truth. You've spent too long thinking you're unseen. That's not who you are. You're strong. You're kind. And you matter, Margaret. To more people than you realize." To me, her breath caught. She wanted to push the words away to protect herself from the emotions they stirred. But she couldn't. They had reached a place in her heart that had been silent for years. She had lived so long with responsibilities, with duty, with silence, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be truly noticed. For a moment she thought she might cry. But she held it back, straightening her shoulders, keeping her voice steady. "You've said enough, Daniel. I'll remember your words, but that's all they can be." "Words?" He nodded. "Not arguing, not pushing." "That's enough," he said gently. "I just wanted you to know." The quiet between them lingered, heavy, but not bitter. Margaret sipped her coffee, her hands still trembling slightly. She knew life would return to normal soon, that Emily would come home, that Daniel would go back to being her daughter's boyfriend. But she also knew the truth. Something had shifted, something that couldn't be undone. And then the sound of tires on the driveway cut through the silence. Margaret's head snapped up. She knew that sound. It was Emily's car. Panic rushed through her chest. The night they had shared, the words spoken, the unspoken feelings, they would all have to be buried now. Daniel heard it too. He set his mug down carefully, his face calm but serious. "She's here," he said simply. Margaret rose quickly, smoothing her sweater, forcing her expression into something ordinary. The door opened, and Emily's cheerful voice filled the house. "Mom, I made it back before the roads flooded. Did you survive the storm?" Margaret forced a smile, her heart racing. "Yes, I managed." Daniel was here, helping out. Emily stepped into the kitchen, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "Oh, you stayed. That's so sweet of you." She wrapped her arms around him easily, without hesitation. Daniel hugged her back, his face carefully neutral. "I wanted to make sure she was safe," he said simply. Emily laughed, completely unaware of the weight in the room. She sat at the table, chattering about her trip, filling the silence with her bright energy. Margaret tried to listen, but her thoughts were far away. She stole a glance at Daniel. He met her eyes for only a second before looking away. The message clear, whatever had passed between them in the storm would remain unspoken from this moment forward. Margaret sat quietly, sipping her coffee, her face calm, her heart unsettled. She knew she could never tell Emily what had happened, never reveal the words that had shaken her so deeply. She also knew she would carry them with her, long after Daniel left. For Emily, the morning was normal. For Daniel, it was a careful balance. But for Margaret, it was the beginning of something she couldn't name. She had been reminded of her worth, of the woman she still was beneath the years of silence. And though the world outside looked clean and calm after the storm, Margaret knew the real storm had taken place within her. Daniel's words had left a mark, one that would stay hidden but never fade. As Emily's laughter filled the kitchen, Margaret forced a smile and joined in. But deep inside, she carried the truth of that night, the touch of a hand, the flicker of a candle, and words that had left her speechless, words she would never forget.